Welcome back. You getting tired yet? We're almost there. Almost to the end of this section. So let's just take a look. When we left off here, what we did was we created a clip. We created a parameter for it inside of our animation controller. And we also created a couple of parameters that we can then use to control those clips. So what I'm going to do now is let's create a new animation clip that we can transition to, and we can kind of test that transition out before we dive into the actual coding, when we'll actually control these things with code. So what I'm going to do is, let's find our rig here. And one thing, just don't confuse this with the 3D file, which is similar in name, but entirely different because it doesn't contain all these cool animations. So the iGuy rig is slightly different than the iGuy model because the iGuy rig has clips with him that are animations. So let's grab that spin clip and let's just drag it and drop it in here in our animation controller. And now we have the clip in there, and we can see here's our parameters, the motion animation that it's using, the speed of that animation, and some of the other aspects of it. But the question we have here is, how do we trigger it, right? So remember, we created these parameters, and we created this parameter right here, spin trigger. We created it specifically for the purpose of spinning this guy, of triggering that animation based on some action, that we can then code later, or an input or a button or whatever. So what I want to do is, even though this clip is in here, right, it doesn't have any way to transition to it. Okay, so let's create one. I'm going to select my default clip, the one that's always going to be running if nothing else is. And I'm going to right click on that. I'm going to choose Make Transition. And you can see this little arrow. It's going to be asking me, where do I want to make a transition to? Entry, exit. I can transition to the exit if I want. Or I can click on spin. This is what I want. So boom, let's click that, and it's going to connect these two animations. And it's going to say something. I can select my transition, which is its own entity right now. Its own set of parameters. So I'm going to select my transition. What that says is we're going to blend this animation into this animation based on something. What can we base it on? Well, a couple things we have to look into first. See this exit time here? Alright, this means that if the animation stops playing, then go to the exit or a transition to something else. So it means wait for some exit time, right? So if I leave this on now and I trigger this animation, what's going to happen is there's going to be a brief pause. Let's leave that on and I'll show you how that's going to happen. Normally we want that off if we want an animation to happen immediately. Alright, exit time. And here we can change the exit time here. Alright, so let's create a condition for this transition. So I'm going to click on plus. And idle speed, that's not the condition we want, but we could say if the speed of our float gets above, let's say, 1, right, then trigger this spin. Okay, so that's one possibility. Now, what I like to do most of the time, we can do anything. We can have all kinds of possibilities here, but usually if I'm triggering like an animation based on input, I make it that trigger. So we've created the spin trigger. So let's choose that instead. Now, the trigger doesn't have any parameters because it's basically a Boolean, but it only gets triggered once and then goes back to normal. So it's a singular Boolean or a trigger, that's how we like to define it. What basically means is it returns a value of true for only a second and then goes back. So once I trigger it, I don't have to leave it on. It's not really a toggle. Alright, so I'm saying that if this trigger is triggered, if it has been put on, turned on, then play this animation. And that's pretty much it. We create a transition between one state and the other, and we tell it what condition upon to make that transition. So let's hit play here. Now I don't have a script here. I don't have any input controlled, right, based on that transition. I can move him around. But I'll have to do this manually in my mechanism window. I'll just click on that, and you should see him jump, okay? Let's try that again. 1, boom, okay. Now what happened? Why did it pause when I went off? Well, remember I said that I've chosen to have an exit time here. We don't really want an exit time. What that means is, there's a certain amount of time to wait before it goes back to, or before it moves from this point to this point, right? So I have to wait for this animation to finish before it goes to spin. We don't really want that. We want this animation to play immediately. And this blending that you see here in the transition, this is how these two clips are going to blend together. So I'm going to turn this exit time off, right? And so as this float, you can see how you can watch it down here. You can see him bobbing up and down, and you'll see him transition into that state. And we can slide these back and forth a little bit. And one of the things I don't want, because it's a blend, is I really want the spin to happen immediately, offset from wherever he is. So, and this changes based on how at what point in time this animation actually is being played. So once again, let's go ahead and hit play. Now I don't have it mapped to any input, so I have to just say boom. Now one of the things I'm seeing here is, let's just click on root motion. I'm seeing that it's going back to the original position there. And let's try that one more time. There we go. Okay, so what I did there, just to reiterate, is I clicked on apply root motion for my animator. That means that it offsets the motion of one animation from another, so it doesn't have an absolute root motion. It kind of does it as relative, so it doesn't go back to some position and play the animation all over again from the original point of the animation. It kind of takes the root motion into consideration. Right, now what we haven't done here is finish the animation by going back to the idle state. So if I have a transition to this animation, I must have one away from it, or it won't go back into that constant idle state. So I'm going to click on Make Transition, and let's go back to the float animation. Now we do want an exit time. We don't need anything in this list if we have an exit time. Meaning, upon exit of my spin animation, it will go immediately back to my float animation. So let's test this out. Now let's just, boom. And there he goes, right back into the float animation. So you can see that as soon as I trigger that to be true, I'm triggering this. It's going to go from one animation to the other smoothly. And right back to the original floating animation as soon as it's done with this spin animation. And let's just make this, we'll play this double speed and see what happens. A little too fast. Now if I want to mirror it, he should go counterclockwise. Let's just see here. It looks like he's going, yeah, counterclockwise. And if I click on mirror, he's still going counterclockwise. One trick generally here is that we can, there we go. If we do the speed at negative, it will reverse the flow of the animation. So we can flip an animation however, as often as we want. Now let's click on negative 0.5 here. Now I'm assuming that he's a little bit jagged because the animation itself is not smoothly interpolating. Based on something, I got to go back and look at the original animation data. But you can see how we created a tradition, just a transition, just to go back and kind of recap what we did here. Is we had an idle animation going, we created a new animation, and we made it transition to that animation based on this spin trigger input, right? And then we created another transition back from the action animation to the default animation. And if we select that transition, we can see that we chose an exit time up here, which means as soon as this is done playing, then it's going to transition into whatever is the end of this arrow. And we can change these parameters a little bit, as you see here. If it has an exit time, we can put them literally we can literally get them bumper to bumper here, which means that there's not going to be a blend in between those. It should make things a little bit smoother. Because they're both technically in the same spot. We should be able to get those transitions to match up here. There we go. All right, so there you have a way to create transitions from one state to another based on an input. When we get back, we're going to trigger that trigger or call up that trigger from a script so we can do everything based on player input.